Tonight, I have something a little bit special for you guys. 6 stories, ranging from ghost stories, odd happenings with the supernatural, and more. The first story is an exclusive story by the incredible AuthorJoJo about astral projection. He's a talented author, narrator, and friend. I will be providing a link to his channel in the description and pinned comment. Be sure to show him some love. Drop him a sub if you'd like. He recently hit 100 subs and deserves a lot more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors for making this video possible. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is of course as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you've recently got interested in astral projection, and rightfully so. There's nothing quite like it. A complete detaching of the body and mind can be incredibly freeing. If you don't know yet how to astral project, this is, unfortunately, the wrong video. There are plenty of other videos and blog posts that can teach you how to do this much better than I. Instead, today we will be discussing the dangerous elements you might face when leaving your body and how to effectively deal with them so that you can return to your body safe and sound at the end of your journey. So please listen carefully as I go over some of the more common issues you'll face. Maybe take notes. For now, we're just covering the potential dangers that you can face while confined to the Earth, as it's suggested for beginners that you don't leave the confines of our little planet until you've projected a comfortable number of times. It's important to recognize what astral projection is. It's the freeing of one's astral form from their physical body. This means your mental facilities are still operating and you are still tethered to the body you leave behind. This is a powerful and spiritual experience, but it does come with its set of drawbacks. Most of these problems stem from the fact that you are of the physical mind, but not body. You're no longer confined to most of the natural laws that govern a form with mass. This can cause a rather harmful disconnect with a reality that you are not in, but are linked to. I hope I'm making some semblance of sense here. A good example of this is the first threat to your well-being that is referred to as soft ground. Soft ground is an interesting interaction between an incorporeal body and the mass that's underneath it. Typically, your astral body will not be affected by laws like gravity, which allows you to move so freely. There are small pockets though, where your astral body interacts with the laws linked to your physical form. These pockets are called soft ground. While not incredibly dangerous to individuals that are well versed in astral projection, it can be a very frightening experience for newcomers and can lead to severe consequences. Say you're gliding down the street and you started to feel a tug, like strings began to pull you down towards the earth below you. You recognize this as gravity, but as you're not a physical being, you become confused by what's causing the sensation. Your understanding of the reality shifts rapidly between that of the body and the mind. All the while, you're pulled further down. Before you know it, your vision becomes dark and you feel an intense rush around you. Essentially, you have fallen victim to the astral plane's equivalent of quicksand. You were affected by the laws of gravity, but since you have no physical form, you sunk right through the earth as you made contact. That rushing you feel isn't your body sinking further towards the core though. The earth is leaving you behind. Before you know it, you'll be ripped out of the ground and watch as the ground gets further and further away from you. Reaching beyond the clouds, the earth will travel away from you faster than you are able to chase it. There you are, in space, as your physical body is on earth, and as you're inexperienced in astral projection. You need to be near your body to return to the physical world. So, you guessed it, you're stuck, floating in the vacuum of space, until either you work out the finer mechanics of astral travel, or the earth returns to you. Your body, though, the one on earth, still has to abide by the laws around it. Things like nutrition and hygiene need to be attended to, but it's stuck without a soul to move it. Hopefully, you manage to make it back before serious repercussions, before you're ruled as comatose or worse. The best thing you can do for yourself to avoid this potential hazard is to take things slow as you're getting comfortable with your astral body. Move cautiously and think rationally. Try to keep one limb ahead of the others at all times. When you feel that tingle, like someone is plucking your arm hairs, then you know you're entering an area with soft ground. Another thing to look out for is memories. These aren't dangerous per se, but depending on the memory you witness, it can be mentally taxing. When you astral project, you are taking your thought process out of your body, meaning your memories are no longer contained in the brain. Within the astral realm, it becomes possible for these memories to become loose and drift away from you. Typically, you'll never lose a memory with positive context behind it. This is both a blessing and a potential risk. You'll never run into another person who is astral projecting, save for a few various beings. You can, however, run into someone else's memories. A lot of people use astral projection as a means of escape, somewhere they can go to feel safe when the negativity is getting to be too much. So, they tend to carry a lot of negative memories into the astral realm, where they become loose and drift. Once a person returns to their body without said memory, it no longer belongs to them. It becomes a construct within the astral, and can be interacted with by other travelers. If you see a memory drifting away from you, it's not hard to get it back. Since you haven't returned to your body, all you have to do is focus on it when you return. Keeping it at the forethought of your head will keep your claim to it. This works both ways though. If you see a stranger's memory, and say it's a particularly horrific one, it can be fairly difficult to get the imagery out of your head. Returning to your body with those thoughts in mind will make those memories yours as well. You'll remember going to parties you never went to, hurting people you never met. This might sound like something you can will yourself to forget, but memories are powerful. They are the blueprints to what makes us who we are, and having new additions to that blueprint can have lasting personality alterations, so please keep your wits about you. There are several minor threats that we can gloss over. These things don't typically have lasting effects, and are a case of learning not to touch hot things, like the jagged. Jagged is typically hard to see, but once you know what you're looking for, they pose no issue. As you float around the astral realm, you'll notice that now and then, an aspect of the world will be stretched. It looks like someone using the smear tool on Photoshop. This is almost the opposite of the soft ground. Soft ground is where the astral plane interacts with natural laws, but jagged are areas where it's straying further away. Concept of what things should look like are less binding. Interacting with something jagged will impact your astral self, as it strays further from what you perceive it to look like. This can feel painful, and typically is all the signs you'll need to get away from the area, if you're sane anyways. Though there have been mumblings that should someone commit and throw their body to the jagged, that individual would reach a plane beyond astral projection. I wouldn't personally recommend that. Even if it were true, there's no guarantee that you could ever make it back. Earth isn't an incredibly dangerous place to explore, so long as you keep your body and mind safe while doing so. Once you know what to look for and how to deal with obstacles, then it'll just all become second nature. You still pose a threat to the outside world, sort of. There are people on Earth that are referred to as half-ins. Just about anyone can become a half-in. It's not a permanent state of mind or anything, but it's like someone taking the steps to astral project without being conscious of it. I'm sure we all have that friend who will just zone out in the middle of a conversation and stare at the wall before you have to snap them to attention. That is a half-in, someone who is just disconnected enough from the physical space around them that they start dipping their toes into the astral plane. This on its own, like many things, isn't inherently dangerous. We all do it without realizing it. We all just knock on the door and run before our consciousness leaves our body. The hazard comes from beginners that are interacting with the astral plane. You'll be able to notice a half-in during projection by a human-shaped glow. The glow will be faint but still noticeable. You should never interact with these glows. A range of different things can happen depending on the individual state of mind. It could be something as innocent as minor manipulations to the half-in's memory, like deja vu, or forgetting why they walked to the kitchen. It could also be something as severe as a heart attack, or something akin to a stroke, as their brain tries to make sense of it, unwillingly falling into the astral realm. Again, just being careful should be sufficient. There's only one thing on Earth that is actively trying to cause harm when astral projecting, and that is the entity dubbed the Indigenous. No one is sure where it came from, or what it's doing here. Really not much is known other than its intents are nefarious. The Indigenous has been blamed for several of the oddities that I've mentioned above. People believe that soft ground and jagged areas are the results of it entering and exiting the astral plane. While the seeping of memories isn't directly caused by it, some people have come to believe that memories are what it's here for. People even speculate that the indigenous is what happens when you submit to a jagged area, that there are multiple indigenous all shifting in and out of the base plane, searching for better highs. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what these things are, only that you recognize it and do anything to avoid it. I'd suggest that if you spot one that you immediately head back to your body and try to project again in a few days. As I told you before, on Earth, there aren't any other intelligent beings you'll run into while out of your body. So, if you see another person, it's a fairly safe bet that you're witnessing the indigenous. You'll be tempted to watch it. Observe how it behaves. You'll think that you've seen it before it's seen you. You'll be wrong. It wouldn't be there if it didn't know you were there, if it didn't know that you could see it. People have mentioned that it is a nearly hypnotic trance you will enter when you lay eyes on it, that your ability to control your spirit body will diminish. It'll start to feel like you forgot how to move, like you're falling into the water with weights around your ankles and wrists. It'll be hard to pull yourself away from it, hard to remember why you would want to run in the first place. When the thing comes into a better view, it'll feel and look familiar to you, but there will be that nagging sensation, telling you that it's dangerous. It will take the form of someone close to you, a parent, a friend, or an idol. It will replicate that person as you see them in your memories. But that's the thing, when you remember someone you never remember them as they really are. There are always small imperfections to how you envision them. It could be the length of their hair, or the way their mouth curls when they smile. Things that, if you saw in person, you would know they weren't right. That's how the indigenous will appear, as your biased vision of someone you can't help but remember. Even beyond that, the flawed representation of your admiration, you'll be able to sense its true self. You'll be able to feel that beyond the skin and clothing, there is nothing. No muscle, nor bone, just a papier-mâché memory. Memories can be fragile. The longer you spend with the indigenous, the more you'll be able to see your memories starting to slip away from you. Not just the bad ones. All those things you hold dear will be pulled out of you and drift towards the copycat in front of you. Some people think that it feeds off those memories, that it sees us as a 3-course meal and hones in to devour every bit that it can get. But I'm not so sure. I think it isn't our memories, but what we become when we've lost them that the indigenous is interested in. The more your memories slip away from you, the more you'll forget the important things, sure, but you'll start to forget how to move. You'll begin to forget why you would even want to leave in the first place. The indigenous plunges its influence into you, and the longer it has that hold, the more it makes you unable to get back to your body. Your astral body draining of the energy and mind, it needs to continue operating until your astral body becomes an empty vessel. Only its surface remains, much like the indigenous. I can't say what happens when you reach that point. No one really can. A few have come in contact with the thing and left scared by their curiosity. Some people forgetting such large chunks of their lives that it was easier to pretend they had full-blown amnesia. So it's best if you see the indigenous to not give it a second thought. Turn around and return to your body. Think of something happy as you return. I'm not sure if there is a side effect of returning with that thing in your thoughts, but I wouldn't roll the dice. So while I haven't listed everything you should look out for while astral projecting, I have touched on the major things that can cause you or others harm. Thankfully, since you're a beginner, you'll only have to deal with the potential dangers that exist on this little blue marble. So with that, my last piece of advice is this. Don't be brave. Don't bite off more than you can chew, and plunge into the deep dark of space. Even if you know how to zip back to your body, give yourself time, for as bad as the indigenous is, there are far worse things resting between the stars and the sky. There's a working notion that the astral plane is some sort of dimensional hub, where the walls of various realities are their weakest, so all sorts of beings that exist beyond our perception of our universe will dwell in that hub. We are humans, exploring this space, and finding out what works and what to avoid. Since you've only just begun your journey, allow me to guide you. To keep you safe, allow me to welcome you to the astral plane. The axe finally managed to break through the large oaken door, enveloping me in even more heat from the inside of the flaming inferno that used to be a large manor house. Black smoke, already pouring out from any opening in the structure that had been created from the raging fire, cascaded over me and my crew, and I once again thanked God for the sealed mask and air pack on my back. Even though my vision was clouded, I raised the axe again and continued my chopping at the door. Now that I had managed to finally put a large crack in it, it only took a few more desperate swings, and the door was splintered enough to allow us to enter the home. Normally, for a fire this large, we would have concentrated more on damage control. There was no way we could save the house, and our efforts would be focused on making sure the fire didn't spread, and no one, including us firefighters, would get hurt. However, this situation was different. We knew people were home. The number of cars parked in front of the house proved this, yet the neighbors, who called us, said they hadn't seen anyone exit the place since the fire began. What was worse, the family who owned the place had a 6-year-old girl named Mary. Almost everyone in town knew Mary. She was such a sweet and friendly soul. Any charitable events that we held for any reason, she wanted to be there to help. I personally had received many of her homemade cookies, since she'd bring by the fire station to thank us for being firefighters. It didn't matter if they were any good or not. Her cute smile and bright demeanor when she delivered them made everyone's day. Imagining such a preciously little girl somewhere in this hellscape, frightened and hurt, added an extra strength to each swing of my axe. And I knew that every other member of the crew felt the same drive to save her as I did. As soon as the door finally broke down, we all rushed in, keeping to our training, but with the added surge of adrenaline to try and rescue as many as we could. Though the spirit was willing, our flesh was almost too weak. Inside the home, the heat was far worse than anything I'd ever experienced. The smoke was much more blinding and choking and thick. It was a swirling, hot mass of light and darkness that threatened to envelop and overwhelm anyone who encountered it. It seemed impossible that anyone could still be alive in this place. But we had hope, and we had a job to do. Team Alpha, we're going to check the upstairs. Team Bravo, you're going to clear the ground floor, and Team Charlie, head to the basement and check for any civilians. Our lieutenant's voice rang in my ears, only seconds after the 9 of us had entered. I answered back over my headset with Team Charlie, copy on, headed to basement to check for civilians. And along with my teammates Johnson and Roberts, prepared for our team's descent into the basement. Not one of the 3 of us were happy to have to go into the basement. Sure, heat and fire rises, but the basement usually has no ways out, other than a single staircase. And if the house falls in on itself, being in the lowest level was assured death. Still, it had to be done, and we had each other for support. We reached the door that led to the basement and found it locked. I put my trusty axe to use again, and the door was broken down in 10 seconds. It was like a dam had broken, and even more black smoke poured up from the bottom. This let us know the fire probably originated from down there, and there was probably not a single living soul in the basement. But we had to check on the small chance someone was. Even though we were completely blind, we made our way down through the encompassing darkness. When we reached the bottom floor, all 3 of us had a feeling that something was wrong. Not like a structure on fire has anything right about it, but the circumstances were all different from anything we'd ever seen or heard about. Though smoke was still flooding the staircase, not a single speck of it touched the main room we found ourselves in. It was like a glass wall was keeping the black vapor only in the vicinity of the staircase. Also, the fire that coated the floors, walls, and ceiling seemed off. I've never seen flames so red, and they were only red. Fire can burn so many different colors, but it never burns just one color. Yet the 3 of us were surrounded in a room of red that seemed to devour any other color, aside from the black smoke. We only stared around in awe for a moment before our training kicked in, and we set to work searching for survivors. It turned out the basement was far bigger than we had thought. In fact, it was so big we decided that we had to split up to search for people. It was dangerous to do that, but time was a major factor here, even more so for any poor soul that was still alive down there. I ended up going down a long hallway and ended up in a decent sized room that looked like a workout room. Glancing around, even with my mask on, I could tell there was no one in the room, and was just about to leave when a glint in the fire caught my eye. There was an iron door built into the wall, seemingly cut into the stone that made up the rest of the basement walls. It didn't look to be made up of traditional iron, but something black and twisted that gave a very off-putting aura around it. I didn't want to have to go near the thing, but I knew that I had to, just to make sure. As I approached it, sounds from beyond the abhorrent thing, other than the crackling of fire, reached my ears. Screams, crying, and moans. On instinct, I rushed to the door, trying to find a way to open it. It looked like the glint that had caught my eye earlier was a large doorknob that had some sort of gemstone encrusted into it. The knob was that of a clawed, demonic hand clasping a ruby, and looking at it brought a bad taste to my mouth. I didn't want to waste any more time looking at the door, however. I was more concentrated on how to get past it to the people behind it. I knew my axe would be useless, so before I potentially injured myself ramming into the door, I decided to try the knob. The heat my hand felt was more powerful than anything I've ever felt before in my life, even with the protective gloves. What I did was obviously stupid, and against everything I'd been taught to do, but hearing the chorus of suffering in the space beyond the door had made me desperate and foolish, thinking of others before my own safety. Of course, that's a stupid way to do stuff, because if I get injured, I wouldn't be in any position to help anyone. Miraculously, the knob turned, and the door swung open on its own. I began to hurriedly enter the room, preparing to direct as many people as I could to safety. I managed to take 2 steps in before I froze in place. Though I was surrounded by fire that burned hotter than anything I'd ever felt before, my blood ran ice cold in my veins at the sight before me. Silhouetted in the red glow of the unnatural fire that ringed me and the room were the bodies. They were charred so much that their twisted, black skeletons were the only things remaining of them. Yet to the horror of my disbelieving eyes, these bodies, though only burnt bone remained, were not dead. They flailed about on the ground, writhing and screaming in agony. Hands wreathed in flame tore at themselves, as if they were trying to grab the fire that covered their very bones and tear it off them. Others scrambled and scratched at the floor and walls, in desperate search of escape from the enveloping blaze that smothered them. Lungs, vocal cords, and tongues had been burnt to ash, yet I could hear their wails and tormented cries. Some managed to form words, crying for mercy and forgiveness, but most just let loose with pitiful shrieks, pulling together to make a choir of suffering and misery. And then I saw Mary. She was sitting, curled up into a ball, on some flaming table or altar around 30 feet from me. Her left side was facing me, and by some miracle, she was completely untouched by the fire around her. She was wearing a lily white dress with her knees up, her arms hugging them, and her face buried into them. From the movement of her brown hair and shoulders, I could tell she was crying, and I couldn't blame her. Everything about the situation I was in vanished from my mind, and my only thought was to get her, carry her in my arms, and bring her out of this hell. I began to make my way over to Mary, but as my heavy boots made contact with the ground, she somehow heard me from across the room. Slowly, she lifted her head to face me, and the absolute terror of what lay before me stopped me immediately. Her left side of her face was normal enough. Green eye, red and swollen from crying, pale cheek, stained with tears, part of her mouth quivering from a sob, but her right side was a completely blackened skull, and inhuman. Her right eye socket wasn't empty, but had a fiery orb, the same color as the fire in the basement. In fact, it seemed like the eye was the source of the fire, as the hellish fire fell like tears from it. Her teeth on the right side of her mouth, visible because there was no lips or cheek to cover them, were long and sharp, like those of some vicious predator. No hair was left on the right side of her burnt scalp, but protruding from her forehead was a wicked, curved horn. The thing that had once been Mary hissed something at me, and through the cacophony of burning wood and stone, through the orchestra of anguish from the dozens of bodies around me, I heard it.
Go. You cannot save her, no matter how you try.
My foot instinctively took a step backwards, but my eyes then focused on Mary's human face, full of pain and torment and despair. I wanted to stay. I wanted to take her out of this place, but something in my very soul held me back. I somehow knew that if any of those infernal flames touched me, my fate would be that of those that littered the ground around me. So, I did as the thing, the devil that was now Mary, commanded. I ran away. Out in the hallway, I practically collided into Johnson and Roberts. I told them I hadn't discovered anyone, and together, we made our way up and out of the basement. Neither of the other 2 teams had found anyone, and once we were all outside, our trucks began pumping water to douse the flames. It took longer than any other house fire we'd faced to put out, and right before the final embers inside flickered out, a long, loud groan echoed through the night air. With a crash, the house fell in on itself, which explained that hair-raising sound we'd all heard before the home's destruction. Only I knew that sound wasn't from any structure or thing from this earth. No bodies were found, not even bones. Detective work really isn't my thing, but a buddy of mine from the precinct later told me at a bar that after investigating all the people who the cars belonged to, they'd found some pretty disturbing stuff. Every single one was from somewhere all across the United States, and all had one thing in common: cultists, all of them. When local police investigated their abandoned houses, they all had weird statues, symbols, and evidence of grisly sacrifices littering the places. I guess they all got what they wanted, or at least deserved in the end. All of them. Except for Mary, I expect. They teach you a lot of things when you train to be a firefighter, but to this day, every time I stare at my right hand, a burned imprint of that clawed, demonic hand forever scarred into my palm. I think about the one thing they don't teach you: what to do in case of a hellfire. When I was younger, a lot younger, my most vivid memories are of the storms. Thunder, lightning, gale-force winds, dark skies lit with bright flashes, pelting raindrops thicker than tears, banging shutters, and tornadoes whipping debris across the flat landscape. During each and every storm, my father would put on his heavy leather coat, wide-brimmed hat, and waterproof boots, open the door, and walk outside. He would stand directly facing the wind, rain, and calamity ahead. There he would wait, regardless of wind or rain, until the storm passed. I have so many memories of him watching storms. When I asked my mother about it, she'd just smile and say my dad was a storm chaser, and watching them was his hobby. She'd send me to bed, pull out some board games, or in some cases, huddle me closer in the closet as we waited for it to pass. This continued for much of my life. There were storms almost weekly. Nearly every week a new storm blew by. None of my friends seemed to know about these storms. Not all of them anyway. But I just thought that was normal. Dad was a storm chaser after all. I was sure he just caught them. Our lives were pretty normal, aside from the storms. I went to school. My parents attended PTA when they had to. My dad taught me sports, or tried to. Sometimes he'd get frustrated when he worked on the family car, and sometimes he would try his hardest to be embarrassing in front of my friends. But you could always tell when a storm was coming. He would get this faraway look in his eyes, and his gaze would constantly drift away, always toward the direction of the approaching storm, whether or not it had been reported on the radio. When this happened, Mom would react immediately. She would pull all the storm shutters, bring in the laundry, cover the car. Anything that wasn't tied down would get tied down. Then she'd sit down in front of my dad, take his hand, and ask, "How bad?" He would mumble a reply, and based on his reply, we'd either break out some board games or hunker down in the closet. Dad would rise with the first thunder, put on his coat, boots, and hat. He would walk to the door, then outside. On my 16th birthday, a storm came. I was so frustrated. I wanted to have my friends over, but Dad got that faraway look, and we had to cancel our plans. I didn't understand it, and I threw a tantrum. Mom went through the routine, calm as you like. It was like everyone was ignoring me, so I thought, screw it, I'm going out. I had my hand on the doorknob when I felt a vice grip on my shoulder. I want to state now that my father had never been one for corporal punishment. He tried spanking me once, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. My father was not a violent man. I need to make that clear because I did not even know my father could grip this hard. He said 2 words to me. They were pretty ordinary words, all things considered, but the circumstances, his vice grip, and the dead, emotionless tone of his voice made me uneasy. "Not yet," he said, with a single motion. He pulled me away from the door and stepped outside. Mom was right behind him, closing the door. "It won't be so bad this time," she told me, before she could offer the board games. I stormed off to my room. I was shaken, but I wouldn't let my pride be stopped. I slammed the door behind me. It was probably 15 minutes before the storm seriously hit. It was pretty bad for a thunderstorm, but still, just a severe thunderstorm. You have to understand, a storm a week for 16 years means I could identify most aspects of a storm based on what I could hear through my walls. It was the rattling of the shutters that gave me an idea. My shutters rattled like this when the wind was blowing directly toward them. That meant that Dad would be standing outside. I inched toward my window, trying to dodge the floorboards I knew would squeak. Carefully, I opened my window, sliding it just enough to reach out of. I carefully unlatched my shutter and pushed it open. It was surprisingly dark out, the wind and rain and clouds blotting out what should have been afternoon sun. At the edge of the light from our house stood my father, coat blowing in the wind, hand on his hat. The wind and rain were deafening. It stung my face where it landed. Then, lightning flashed, a complex, multi-branched arc that lit the sky, and something else. I only saw it for a moment. A massive shadow in the distance. Fuck, it's a tornado. I thought to myself. Dad was never wrong about the severity of the storms. I was immediately worried. I wanted to tell Mom, but I didn't want her to know I'd been watching. Lightning flashed again. This time, the arc seemed to strike something. It arced in complex circular patterns that almost looked like eyes. The two circles then flashed up and seemed to fix on me. At the same time, my dad threw up his hand and a gust of wind hit the shutters, throwing them closed and knocking me backward. My mom was in an instant later, looking for the first time in her life, afraid. She slammed the window closed and without a word, dragged me into the closet. I spent the rest of the increasingly violent storm listening to her quiet sobs, feeling her twitch with each one. If I strained, I could hear her whispering, "Not yet," almost audibly under her breath, over and over and over again. I didn't try to look again after that. The storms got worse though. Every one seemed more violent than the last, so much so that my parents invested in metal storm shutters, and even a storm cellar, everything we didn't even consider in the past. Despite this increased activity, nothing new really happened until my 18th birthday. That day, there were 2 coats, 2 hats, and 2 pairs of boots on the coat rack at home. I looked for the visitor, but my father was just sitting at the table, staring off in the distance again. I started to leave the kitchen to find Mom, but my dad called out, "Wait, please, sit down," he said. It was the first time my father had directly spoken to me on a storm day. Naturally, I sat. "Today," he said calmly. I should have been confused, could have asked questions, but I knew. Ever since that day 2 years ago, I knew that "not yet" was temporary, so I sat. At first, time seemed to crawl by, and my eyes wandered, until they found something. Whatever I stared at, the direction my father stared. It wasn't that I saw something, not necessarily. It's like I felt something deep in my bones, a kind of rumble, like thunder you can't hear. My father and I sat, staring into the distance. As soon as the first thunder sounded, he rose. I was only a moment behind him. I immediately understood the extra clothes were mine. We donned our boots, long coat, and hat in silence. I hesitated at the door. "Wait, Mom?" I started. "She's in the cellar. This isn't for her," he replied, before throwing open the door to the sound of 1,000 steam trains. I knew from experience it was a tornado, and a big one by the judge of it. There wasn't rain, but the wind was vicious. No, this wasn't a storm for rain. The wind would keep the rain from hitting the ground, and it would fall as hail elsewhere. I followed my father outside, hand firmly on my hat. Its stiff, wide brim angled downwards to protect my eyes from dust and wind. We strode directly out, stopping about 15 paces from the front door. My father stood, and I stood at his side. The steam trains roared viciously, but never came any closer. It was nearly pitch black outside. Visibility was cut off like a knife at the edge of our porch light, and we both stood with our toes at the line. Wind whipped us from every direction. Trains roared their ghostly cries, and for the first time, I noticed that it wasn't coming from one direction, but every direction. Our family has watched storms for as long as anyone can remember. My father's calm voice reached me, despite the wind filling my ears, and the echoing wails rattling my bones. We don't remember when it started, and why is not something that can simply be explained. He went quiet. Lightless thunder rumbled in the distance. "It can only be shown." Following his words, he brought his hands together in a mighty clap. Directly ahead, in the sky, a multi-branched lightning bolt crept closer than it should through the clouds. What I saw, I still don't know how to explain. It was like a web, covering the whole sky in a three-dimensional mesh. Cells of dead air with thick, black borders made of violent cyclones, all interconnected in a mind-numbing fractaline latticework. This mesmerizing net of lightning and wind and rain wasn't what held my gaze, however. It was the thing beyond the lattice. It stalked, eyes blacker than the surrounding darkness, a form indescribably twisted upon itself, folded into itself and among itself in ways that twisted my very gut. It was a shape that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, but there it was, stalking the outside of the cyclone barricade. And that's exactly what it was, a barricade, bars of the most violent forces our planet has to offer, woven together in such a way that this thing couldn't squeeze through. It locked eyes with me, visually. There was no way to discern where it looked, but you could feel its gaze, feel it like it was physically caressing each individual atom of your body. Under its gaze, you too became uniquely aware of every single particle of yourself, like the very act of being observed was unraveling you, laying you to bare and naked before its eyes. It was then that I found something inside myself, a spark, an ember, whatever you want to call it, under this thing's unwavering observation. I learned what it truly meant to stand sentinel at the gates of reality, to maintain the barricade, to watch for cracks, to watch for weakness, to shore up the walls with mortar when required, and I understood. When I was younger, my father used to watch storms. Now, it's my turn. I answered a booming knock at the door to find a tall, well-built police officer with a shaved, blonde head and a square jaw. The wire extending from his radio and the gun in his holster made him seem every bit a part of the machine he served. I'm here because a resident reported a disturbance last night, said she heard someone screaming. Mind if I come in and take a look around? The cop asked. My roommate, Marie, was noticeably distressed, despite the fact her stash of marijuana was already hidden safely under the DVD cupboard. I couldn't hide the panic from my eyes either. Nah, come in, I said. Marie sat stiffly in the recliner and let me answer most of the questions while she let her nerves settle. You have any weapons on the premises? Asked the cop. Yeah, just a decorative sword and some throwing knives in that closet there. He opened the closet to find the weapons caked with dust. I hoped my honesty would earn his trust. You don't have any firearms though. I eyed his gun anxiously. They frightened me. I continued with a nervous chuckle. Satisfied, he closed the closet and entered Marie's room. He found nothing there but dark clothes and horror memorabilia. When the cop searched my room, however, he was noticeably taken aback by how cluttered it was. I never got around to clearing out the drive-through bags that littered the floor. Oh man, the cop said, you need to clean your room. That's true, I said mirthfully, trying to hide my offense at his comment. What business was it of his, really? It's not like anything illicit was buried underneath. Has that window always been open? He asked, pointing at my window. Yeah, most of the time. But you didn't hear a scream? No. He watched me carefully as I answered. Okay, he nodded, walking back to the living room. My nerves began to get the better of me as well, so I sat on the couch beside Marie's recliner while the cop addressed the both of us. So let me just come right out and say it. I know there's drugs in here. My heart skipped a beat, and I saw the blood rush to Marie's face. Now the good news is that I don't care. Just between us, I think it's a bullshit law and a waste of taxpayer money. More importantly though, I don't have a drug warrant because that's not the reason I came here. One of the residents from this same building reported a scream around 3 o'clock in the morning, and none of you heard it? Could be someone turned a movie up too loud, I said, turning to Marie. I was asleep from like 10 to 6-ish. Only got up an hour ago, she said. So whoever called must have lied, asked the cop, looking at me. Just called 911 for yucks? I threw my hands up and shook my head. I wish I could help you, honestly. Neither of us heard anything. I spoke up sincerely as possible, just wishing he would go away. He stood silently for a moment, looking over Marie and myself. Okay, y'all have a nice day. At last, he showed himself out the door, and I followed swiftly to lock the door. Marie smiled with relief and exhaled a long breath. I'm glad he was cool about the drug thing, she said. I nodded, not looking directly at her. I mean, I didn't hear anything. Did you? Nah, no way, I said. You know I would have said something if I knew I could help. That's true, she said. Thankfully, she didn't catch my slip of the tongue. After all, I couldn't tell her. I most certainly couldn't tell the cop, a stranger. How could I account for what I saw last night after being woken up by the horrible scream? Just below my second-story window. Who would believe me if I described the unimaginable creature that dragged the poor, bloodied girl under the streetlight, that towering monster with ashen skin under black wings? Its saurian snout housed jagged teeth, and its fiery, glowing eyes reflected the light like the eyes of a jaguar. I was paralyzed when it looked up at me, and I prayed the darkness of my room shielded me from the gaze of the stone gray dragon. Perhaps it didn't see me, or perhaps it didn't care. I could hardly guess. Who would believe me? I popped the top off of 3 cold beers and closed the lid to the ice chest. This was my favorite part of every summer. We worked hard all year in school, and it was time for our annual campout to begin. It was special this time though. We were seniors now, and no matter how much we tried to act like we could keep the tradition alive, I think we all knew this was the last time we would be doing this. Jimmy was choking hard after taking a huge hit from the bong, and I walked right in time. Here man, wash it down with this. I handed him a brew and passed the other to Mike before taking my seat on the other side of the crackling fire. I took a sip and exhaled deeply while looking around the fire at my friends. What is it, Aaron? Looking for this? Jimmy smiled as he held up the bong towards me. Nah man, it's just... This is it, you know? Time for the whole new chapter. You are going to the state university. Mike is leaving for 2 states over. And I will be here at the local community college. I took another sip and stared into the burning fire, feeling a bit down after pulling it all into words. Mike noticed the somber tone in my words and chimed in. Well, why don't we tell some ghost stories for old time's sake? That's always been one of our favorite traditions, and we're right here around the campfire. Ready and in position. I know one of you guys has a good one to start. Jimmy? Jimmy sat the bong down and took a long drink from his beer. He looked pensively towards the fire. Nah man, why don't one of you guys go first? I'll sit on it for a minute. His reaction struck me as strange. He seemed so serious and withdrawn with the topic. Usually, he was all for rattling stories off left and right. He once swore that it was a ghost who moved the ketchup bottle in his refrigerator, and would hear nothing of our claims that it was definitely just a family member. I decided that I would start to show them that I wasn't so down in the dumps, as they might have thought. No problem. I think I got a pretty good one. The other night, I woke up to take a leak. I was walking down the hallway when I heard a loud thump from the other room. I stopped in my tracks, and when I did, a cold chill surrounded me. I totally freaked out and ran back to my room without even going to the bathroom. Mike laughed and responded to the story. Oh, come on, Aaron. That noise could have been anything. It was probably your cat. And you know that there is an air vent in that hallway. I'm pretty sure that summertime in Texas, y'all had the AC on. Alright. I'm not gonna lie. I thought of all that the next morning, but it scared me like crazy that night. And one of us had to get these stories started, right? I chuckled, and then shot a challenge back at Mike. Why don't you go next, since you're such a hard-to-please skeptic tonight? Mike replied snidely to this with an upturned nose and holding his pinky out off the side of his beer. Gladly. Pleasant. I motioned a quick jerk with my free hand and responded sarcastically. Oh please, bless us with your incredible stories. Alright, so a few weeks ago I was at the gym late one night. There was hardly anyone there, and when I made it to the locker room, it was completely empty. I went to take a quick shower, and then heard the water cut on in the stall a few doors down from me. I thought it was weird, but still finished up my shower. On my way back to the lockers, I looked down under the bottom of the door while walking by. I couldn't see anybody's feet. There was nothing there at all. I was so freaked out. I hurried up and got dressed and left. I didn't see another person in the locker room the whole time. Now I was the one who was laughing before coming back with a quick-witted response. Dude, you know that someone was probably just turning the water on, so it would get hot, right? Even if you don't see them, they probably just went to the other room to use the toilet or something. That story was weak. Mike looked a little shocked by the statement at first, but then just laughed it off and took a swig of his beer. Yeah, I guess I didn't think about that. You're probably right. What about you, Jimmy? Jimmy had been oddly introspective for the entirety of both of our stories, just kinda zoned out and appearing to be lost in thought. I spoke up as well, hoping to break his trance-like state. Yeah, man, why are you being so quiet over there? You're usually all into this part of the campout. Jimmy seemed to snap out of it and tried to play it off like nothing was bothering him. Oh yeah, sorry. I was listening. I have just kinda had a bunch of pretty crazy ones this past year. I'm ready to go though, if you guys don't have any more. Mike responded before I could get anything out. Oh, you're really hyping it up this year. You must have a good one for us. Come on then, let's hear it. Okay, well I'm not really sure where to start. When I would be lying down to go to sleep, I would hear footsteps in the hallway. You guys know it's just me and my parents, and it's not like them to be on that side of the house at night. I would call out, and sometimes even be brave enough to go look, but there was nothing, just footsteps. And a few times, there'd be a loud bang afterward on my door or my wall. The lights would flicker sometimes, no matter how new the light bulb was. I would change them out just to test it. The creepiest of all though, was when I would hear whispers right in my ear. Sometimes, it would be my name or something I couldn't understand. Other times, it would say some evil, disgusting things I don't even want to repeat. He sat back and looked at our shocked faces before adding one last thing. I don't know if this is related at all, but I have been having the same dream like every night. There is a face right in front of mine, like they're on top of me in my bed, just staring at me from an inch away. They don't blink or move, and the dream lasts like for the entire night. It almost reminds me of when I used to get sleep paralysis from time to time. Only this is something extremely weird and different. I tried to gather myself and not leave my jaw completely dropped as it had been. I was the first to say something after his stories that stunned both Mike and me. Holy shit, dude. Are you being serious right now? I don't even know what to say to all of that. I would probably piss my pants if any of those things had happened to me. Mike expressed his shock as well. Yeah, man. Wow. I had no idea you'd been having all that stuff happen. Why didn't you ever say anything at school? Jimmy shook his head and answered, it's kind of weird, you know? Not the usual offhanded topic. Didn't want people thinking I was going crazy or something. He shoved the bong into Mike's chest and laughed in an attempt to lighten the mood. Here, bro. I wasn't trying to kill the mood or anything. We got a long night of partying ahead of us. Aaron, do you still got that chill playlist on your phone? I took it out and unlocked it, but saw the two words that I'd dreaded I might. No service. Crap. I shoved it back in my pocket and turned to Mike, as I found it to be my turn in the rotation. Mike was coughing but managed to respond to this. I have one downloaded on mine. I thought that might happen out here. The music came on, and we were back to talking about the school year, girls, and many other things spanning all the way back to middle school when we all first met. It was an incredible time that none of us would ever forget, and before we knew it, the flames began to die down along with our stash of party favors for the evening. I was the first to admit defeat, as I usually was, and told them all that I was going to head into the tent. They gave me the usual breaking of the balls, but were not too far behind in joining me once I crashed. I was out as soon as my face hit the pillow, wrapped tight in my sleeping bag. I woke up to a loud screeching howl, a guttural and animalistic bellowing, and sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. Mike was up in his sleeping bag as well, and between us lay the empty sleeping bag of Jimmy. I looked at him in terror. Shit, man. Jimmy is out there. What if he went to take a piss and whatever is out there is about to get him? Mike was frantically rummaging in his bag and pulled out a large hunting knife along with a couple of flashlights. He handed one of them to me and hopped up out of his bag. We won't have much time if that's the case. Follow me, dude. Hopefully with two of us running up on it, the thing will just run away. My heart was pounding out of my chest, but I nodded to him and followed right behind. There was no way around it. We had to find our friend. We stepped outside of the tent and only heard the wind rustling through the trees. The campfire had declined to nothing more than an ashen pile of embers. The only light with the complete darkness of the woods were our two flashlights skimming through the trees. Mike called out, "Jimmy, where are you at? We got your back. Just get away from whatever that thing is now." We walked a bit further from the campsite, towards where we had heard the terrible sounds coming from. That is when our flashlights came across something that I will never be able to forget. It was Jimmy, but he wasn't right. His eyes were rolled back into his head, and his face was drained of all color. He appeared to be shaking violently, and after just a moment of being in our gaze, He cocked his head back and let out a violent shriek. It was the same noise we heard from the tent. There was no doubt about that. It made no sense that such a sound could come from a human being, but I saw it with my own eyes. As my blood ran cold with fear, Jimmy dashed to the side away from the light of our flashlights at an inhuman speed. "Oh my god, dude. What in the world is wrong with him? What are we going to do?" I whispered in a panicked and wavering tone to Mike. He responded trying to sound confident, but still obviously shaken by what we had just seen. "I don't know, man. I mean, we may have to do whatever is necessary if he comes at us all crazy like that. I don't want to, but you saw him, man. I know you just saw that." He held the knife in his hand ready to strike as we moved into a back-to-back position and continued scanning the woods for any sign of Jimmy. I made another comment that was full of fear and uncertainty as the first. "You can't do that, man. He's obviously sick or something. We have to get him help. Maybe we can just take him down and tie him up or something." Mike seemed offended by the statement and shot back quickly. "Sick? Fucking sick? Really? Did that look like Jimmy was sick to you? Because if it did, I'm starting to wonder if you are sick." We heard some branches crack over to the left of us and both turned to see what it was. We directed our flashlights and scanned the area but saw nothing. That is when we heard from behind us a voice that belongs nowhere, but in the nightmares of the criminally insane. It was a voice that spoke with two voices, one shrill and high-pitched, that had the screeching effect of metal against metal, rattling in eardrums. The other was the most deep and demonic-sounding voice that I have ever heard or will ever hear again. It vibrated my very bones and seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet, though it could have also been my trembling body playing tricks on me. "We have taken your friend. We will use him for whatever we wish until he is of no more use to us. We will be coming for you next. There is nowhere to hide." After this warning, the thing that used to be Jimmy let out another ear-shattering howl and took off into the night. We stood there in awe for a bit, trying to wrap our minds around what we had just witnessed. When I was sure enough that we were alone, I grabbed some wood from beside the fire pit and stoked the flames back into full life. There was no way that I was about to fall back asleep, and there was absolutely no way that I was walking through these woods at night with whatever had taken over Jimmy, possibly lurking in the darkness. It seemed that Mike had the same idea as he took a seat across from me by the fire. He put his hands on his head and just kind of sat there reeling from the night's events. We sat in silence for what seemed like an eternity, adding sticks and logs to the fire to ensure that we had enough light for our surroundings. When morning came, we packed our things as well as Jimmy's and started to make our way out of the woods. As soon as one of us could get a signal, we would have to call the cops, our parents, and Jimmy's parents to tell them what we had all seen. We decided on that while packing up. Mike was not so sure at first, afraid of what people might think or what they might do to us. I convinced him, though, that if we were honest, there were far more positives than if we decided to lie. The police did not believe our stories for a second, and our parents tried to be supportive, but we could see it in their eyes that they felt the same. Jimmy's parents were devastated for obvious reasons, and we did our best to assure them that we would be able to find him. He had been in those woods somewhere, right? Although, I felt they might have seen through it to our disbelief the same way that we had seen through our parents. The police found beer bottles and some traces of marijuana. That was all they needed to mark this one off as some kids getting all high and crazy in the woods. It completely discredited anything that we were trying to tell them about what actually happened. Our parents were very disappointed as well, and everyone started to think that we must have wandered off after getting too messed up and gotten lost. The search went on for weeks. Jimmy's parents put up flyers, went with the police to comb the woods for as long as they would let them, and called all his friends, who they thought he might have been staying with for one reason or another. After a while, we all kind of just kept going on without Jimmy. We all kept operating, though, our mundane tasks with a hole in our heart, with one of us gone missing. I've heard that these things never really go away. They kind of just stay there buried deep within you until someone brings it back into your mind, and it is like you are reliving it all over again. I can agree that it is kind of like that. Jimmy was like a brother to Mike and me. We had always done everything together. Sleepovers, sports. We even all took our dates to the school dances together. Things will never be the same without him. The only thing harder than losing Jimmy is having to always have in the back of our minds the last words we heard him say. That the thing that had taken him over, whatever it was coming for both of us. We live in constant fear of what may happen when the thing is done with him. I'm beginning to fear that my time is coming much sooner than I had anticipated. Every night this week, I have heard that same howl that we saw coming out of Jimmy's mouth. That terrible, shrieking howl. As I write this, in fact, I can hear the howl approaching. It is coming closer than it has any of the other nights that I've heard it. I'm afraid I won't be able to give any more details at this time. I'm going to go and call Mike. He needs to know that after tonight, he must stay away from me. He needs to know that Jimmy's time might be coming to an end, and that I am next. Our town never had a siren. The sleepy, quaint little town I grew up in was desolated. The only life prevalent were the few people that weren't affected by the companies that took an interest in the abundance of natural resources we had underneath the ground. Those skank bags were the reason why my best friend had to find a new residence 600 miles away from the US. Sure, he was paid the equivalent of a flight on a Virgin Galactic ship, but only because he was in the way of their precious silver and copper. The reason I hated them so much was that their workers had no clue what they were doing. They had torn down so many homes and just left them there. They hadn't even started digging for the materials, and it had been over 2 years. A few months after my friend was relocated, their corporation discontinued, leaving the homes that our people built with their own hands in ruins. Our town went from looking like the front cover of a fashion magazine to the front cover of a North Korean propaganda magazine. Everything was an eyesore. Our town was left looking like the aftermath of an EF4 tornado. Our town never had a siren. It wasn't torn down along with the houses, as that would most likely be a federal offense. But our town just sprouted without one. I don't know how no one ever noticed, but I don't think anyone cared, let alone knew our town even existed. To combat the struggle of not having a siren, we had the Weather Channel play 24/7 on a TV in a house built specifically for it, respectively called the Weather Room. If we wanted to know the weather, we would just walk over there. It was the weather from a town nearly 50 miles away, so it wasn't necessarily accurate. If I remember correctly, the beginning of the story that hasn't ended yet began about a month ago. Attention everyone. Our town was so screwed from the companies that we needed a bullhorn to get the message across. Not that it mattered, as our town was less than a square mile. A thunderstorm is approaching soon with extremely high winds. Please stay indoors for the rest of the day. If things get worse, go to the lowest level of your house. Thank you for your attention. We had heated the exact same warning many times before, and because we had heated the exact same warning many times before, no one listened to the message, and because no one listened to the message, everyone did their normal duties outside. And when the storm came, because everyone did their normal duties outside, someone was struck unrecognizable in the midst of it when he was slammed against a tree. Half of his face was missing, and his left arm was dangling by a single tendon. His body was pinned by a metal rod of a torn down house protruding through his back. When the storm passed, he still remained alive. 8 hours exactly. And in those 8 hours, he repeated the same sentence. The sirens. Stop the sirens. It was a wonder that he stayed alive for so long under those harsh conditions. Our town never had a siren. 2 weeks later, people started complaining about hearing a siren in the distance. It started with Jeffrey Hills, the neighbor across the street, then Matrice Johnson, the lady that lived in her dry cleaner's shop. That damn siren, always going off when I need it least, Matrice told me. I mean, what is it warning us for anyway? No clue, ma'am, I replied back. I was taught to respect my elders, so I didn't want to scare her by stating that there was no siren. The next day, I walked down the stairs to go to school, with the few classmates left. My mom gave me a set of clothes. Can you drop this off at Matrice's for me on the way to school? I need these clean for work tomorrow. I grabbed the clothes and took them to Matrice. You know, I swear that siren is getting closer every day. I can't shake off this feeling. It feels like the siren is watching me or something. It's like it's creeping up behind me, but when I turn back, nothing is there. But the sound still grows louder. It's terrifying me. Are you okay? I ask. Do you want me to help you with anything? Maybe some pills will help stop the noise? It's quite alright. I don't want you to go through the trouble of helping me. But thank you for the offer. I appreciate it. Yeah, no problem, I say as I exit the door. See you soon. I went to school as per usual, but what Matrice said lingered in my mind. Our town never had a siren. That night, I lay asleep. I was awoken by Jeffrey yelling, "Shut up! I can't get any sleep anymore! With this siren! Turn it off!" It became constant. Every night, he would yell, each day getting softer and softer. He began to lose his voice from his constant screaming. Finally, the yelling stopped. I originally found comfort in the silence, but it soon got too quiet. I decided to check up on Jeffrey. I walked to his house, noticing his car still in the driveway, and knocked on the door. No reply. "Hello, Jeff? Are you doing okay?" No reply. Fingers sweating, hand trembling. I moved my hand to the door handle and slowly opened it. I checked every room, advancing my way to the second floor. "Jeff, are you okay?" I walked up the bedroom and opened the door. There was nothing in there. He had disappeared. I turned around and made my way out of the bedroom until I noticed something. There was a hand peeking out of the closet of an unchecked room. I walked up to the closet and gagged. Jeffrey didn't exist anymore, but only a heap of what he once was. He was folded and twisted into a knotted mess. His left leg was stuffed into his mouth, and his lungs were torn out of his body and placed in the center of the mangled corpse. Yet, they still moved. Something was keeping him alive to experience the torture and pain for as long as possible. I ran away as fast as I could. Our town never had a siren, but I still ran to Matrice's shop, worried what happened to Jeffrey would happen to Matrice too. When I entered the shop, I found a note. "To whoever may read this, if you are reading this, I am no longer alive. The room behind this note contains my body. Please do not go back there. I know what I heard was a figment of my imagination, but I know that I couldn't take it much more. I decided to end it before it would warp into anything worse. To everyone I've ever known, I'm sorry." Matrice was like a second mother. Knowing that she was gone made me feel a kind of loneliness I had never experienced before. Nothing, no one could help me find any sort of landmark to lead me somewhere happier. Somewhere without the thought of Jeffrey's morphed body, with breathing lungs and Matrice's neck tied to a noose. Somewhere that didn't have a population of 18. Somewhere near my best friend and my extended family. And I think when I grew lonely and depressed, just like the town I grew up in, it happened. Our town never had a siren, but last night I heard it.